Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm so delighted to be speaking with you from my home. I know it's a pretty busy day for many of us, so I thought I'd start off with a few images of botanical bliss. I am honored to be speaking with you today about the story of Mount Auburn Cemetery and its founders, a group of Boston horticulturalists and civic leaders who envisioned a new kind of burial space for Boston and for the nation. Many of you are familiar with Mount Auburn already. I've seen that in the chat. You've been to programs or come to walk or been for funerals, or maybe you have family buried at Mount Auburn. You may drive by the iconic Egyptian Revival gateway on the road between Harvard Square and Watertown Square, designed by Dr. Jacob Bigelow in the summer of 1832. The gateway was intended to be sublime and convey a sense of permanence. Today, it's a city landmark and point of entrance for more than 200,000 visitors a year. Mount Auburn is one of the most beautiful landscapes I know, a landscape of commemoration that continues to grow and evolve as it responds to the needs of the community. Established in 1831, the cemetery was designed with intention and purpose to provide Boston with a practical solution to its burial problem and to provide access to nature and to a designed landscape that would be consoling and inspiring to all classes of society. Emerson walked here, Robert Frost read Virgil here, and a young Emily Dickinson visited in 1846 and wrote home about it to her friend. It's one of the places to go where you can feel the depth of our history, and more specifically, you can feel the depth of Boston's history. With more than 100,000 lives remembered here, and as a busy, functioning cemetery, Mount Auburn is a sacred site that holds the range of emotions surrounding death, grief and mourning, healing and renewal. As the first rural cemetery in the country, and as a National Historic Landmark, Mount Auburn is significant for its history and for its innovative landscape design, the first of its kind in the country. A beautiful tract of land, 175 acres, abundantly covered with trees, and 4 miles west of Boston toward the setting sun, which is where our story begins. In Boston, in 1821, a New England writer opined the burying place continues to be the most neglected spot in all the region, distinguished from other fields only by its leaning stones and the meanness of its enclosures, without a tree or shrub to take from it the air of utter desolation. Boston burying grounds had provided functional rather than aesthetic places to bury the dead, and with the dramatic increase in population, they were overcrowded, and any space for new burials was running out. Urbanization and overcrowded conditions brought concerns about contaminated air and bad water, and contagious diseases such as whooping cough or Asian cholera and yellow fever. Justice Joseph Story asked, "Why should we measure out a narrow portion of earth for our graveyards in the midst of our cities, where bodies are heaped upon each other with a cold, calculating parsimony that wounds the sensibilities of the living?" Conscious of the perceived health concerns and that the deplorable state of Boston's burying grounds from abandonment, vandalism, relocating, reflected badly on the city, Mayor Josiah Quincy created and led a burial reform initiative, and in 1822 proposed banning interments within the city altogether. A reform movement was already underway. The previous year, which was 1821, William Tudor, an author, diplomat, and co-founder of the Boston Athenaeum, co-founder of the New North American Review, and also who's known for coining the expression of Boston being the Athens of America, Tudor proposed a new kind of burying ground. He wrote, "Our burial grounds in large towns throughout the United States are much too crowded and too much neglected. They have a desolate look of abandonment. A reform in our cities, a reform in our cemeteries would be honorable to public feeling. An ample piece of land should be selected and devoted to the purpose. It would be easy, without great expense, to give the walls and entrance an appropriate appearance. The yew, the willow, and other funeral trees would form suitable ornaments within. A sufficient space might be allowed to different families to decorate as they choose, and where their remains would repose for ages untouched. Such a cemetery would be an interesting spot to visit." So this is exactly 10 years before the founding of Mount Auburn, when William Tudor proposed a vision for a cemetery outside of the city. Tudor had a college friend named Jacob Bigelow. The son of a minister, Bigelow had grown up on a farm in Sudbury and was highly regarded in all of his wide-ranging interests. Really a remarkable man, a visionary physician, botanist, author, architect, and professor who taught medicine and botany at Harvard. Bigelow was one of the founders of MIT and known for popularizing the word technology. But especially in his role as physician, he recognized the health concerns of the Boston burial crisis. And after the controversy played out a little bit in the newspapers, in November 1825, Bigelow invited a dozen civic-minded leaders to his house on Summer Street in Boston to propose a solution, a new burial ground outside of the city of Boston in a picturesque landscape. Who was there at his house at 11 Summer Street that day? They were merchants, bankers, industrialists, lawyers, and entrepreneurs, who for the most part had worked their way up from humbler beginnings like Bigelow. Out of the dozen who were invited, about 8 men came, but one could not. One who could not was General Henry A. Dearborn. Dearborn, son of a Revolutionary War hero, Henry Alexander Scammell Dearborn, was a soldier, statesman, and author. He studied law with Joseph Story in Salem and practiced for a few years before changing to engineering, which he learned in the War of 1812, and to public service as a congressman and state senator, and later mayor of Roxbury. And after designing Mount Auburn, he was designer of Forest Hill Cemetery. General Dearborn was an ardent horticulturalist. He grew flowers and pears on his estate in Roxbury and helped to test seedlings brought back from Belgium and France. In 1831, the same year Mount Auburn Cemetery was founded, General Dearborn first exhibited a pear, later named Dearborn's Seedling, in his honor. And this is an incredible name for a magazine. The magazine of horticulture, botany, and all useful discoveries and improvements in rural affairs. That magazine wrote about him. No individual has done more to create a taste for horticulture in this country than General Dearborn, and it is in great degree owing to his exertions as the first president of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society that gardening has made such rapid advancement in the city in the vicinity of Boston. In 1829, Dearborn had helped to found the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, incorporated for the purpose of encouraging and improving the science and practice of horticulture and promoting the amelioration of the various species of trees, fruits, plants, and vegetables, and the introduction of new species and varieties. There was a real enthusiasm for horticulture in 19th century Boston, and this enthusiasm for horticulture went hand in hand with an idea of nation building and improving the young republic. Dearborn wrote, "We must develop resources in our own country. The indigenous forest trees, ornamental shrubs, flowers, fruits, and edible vegetables of North America are remarkable for their variety, size, splendor, and value." Members of this new society were pretty much elite gentlemen cultivators, Harvard intellectuals, and merchants with estates in Roxbury and Dorchester. But they had a populist mission to be a benefit for all. To advance the science and art of horticulture, Dearborn gathered 17 botanists to the society, including Dr. Jacob Bigelow, who had recently contributed to the National Study of Botany with this illustrated book, American Medical Botany, being a collection of the native medicinal plants of the United States, etc., with his own color illustrations. He did all the illustrations for that book. So that became a national reference. And his other book, Florula Bostoniensis, a collection of plants of Boston and its environs, was a groundbreaking guide to all the New England plants. It's a book beloved by the horticulture staff at Mount Auburn. Activities of the Horticultural Society included collecting, exchanging, and growing foreign as well as local plants. For this, they needed land for an experimental garden. This was essential to their work, but they lacked the resources. So when Jacob Bigelow, pictured here, joined the society the first year as corresponding secretary, with characteristic promptness and energy, he suggested to Dearborn that they combine their two projects into one. Combine Dearborn's Garden of Experiment with Bigelow's proposal for a cemetery for Boston in a landscape setting. Bigelow would get the backing of the energetic and popular Horticultural Society to create, a community support for his proposal. And Dearborn would get funding from the sale of cemetery lots to create his Garden of Experiment. I find it amazing that Dearborn and Bigelow merged their two cherished and separate projects into one that they could both get behind. It was a practical solution and it was an inspired solution. Everything came together when George Watson Brimmer offered his Watertown property to the society. The old stone estate, known as Sweet Auburn, was land that he had recently purchased, and he offered it at cost to the Massachusetts Horticultural Society in the summer of 1831. Dearborn visited the site that Bigelow already knew well. He was a college friend of Brimmer's. Dearborn heartily approved, and a new American landscape was born. The Stone Estate, which became the Brimmer Estate, was a gorgeous 72 acres overlooking the Charles River. Brimmer had initially purchased it to preserve the magnificent trees and the blossoming orchards, and to preserve the site from being subdivided or developed for factories along the Charles River. He just thought it was a gorgeous site, which it was indeed. And there in the background of this painting, you see a hill, and that hill is the mountain of Mount Auburn. Right away, the Horticulture Society and its president, Henry Dearborn, set a campaign in motion to extol the beauties of the site and to sort of gather up interest in both his garden idea and the cemetery. The great orator, Edward Everett, wrote in the newspaper, "The spot which has been selected for this establishment has not been chosen without great deliberation. It stands near a fine sweep in Charles River. It presents every variety of surface, rising in one part into a beautiful elevation, level in others, with intermediate depressions, and a considerable part of the whole covered with a natural growth of the wood. In fact, the place has long been noted for its rural beauty, its romantic seclusion, and its fine prospect. And it is confidently believed that there is not another to be named possessing the same union of advantages." And the trees were extraordinary. Dearborn wrote, "There are numerous majestic oaks, pines, beeches, and walnuts which have braved the storms of a century. Towering aloft amidst the general verdure and extending their huge branches far and wide, they appear as the venerable monarchs of the grove, but still exhibit the vigor of their luxuriant progeny, which in umbrageous contiguity cover each hill and plain and sloping vale." He was known to be one of the best authors for putting his thoughts and feelings into words. Dearborn was really admired as a writer. And now as a designer, what were their design inspirations? What were Bigelow, Brimmer, Dearborn, and the Horticultural Society looking at? What inspired their design? Well, in addition to the literature and the romantic art of the time, Bigelow, Brimmer, and Dearborn were in fact aware of the new burying ground in New Haven, as it was called. It's now called the Grove Street Burial Ground. It was a new burying ground in New Haven, founded in 1796 by the US Senator James Hillhouse. And what was unique about this cemetery was that it was arranged in family lots, something that contemporaneous cemeteries didn't do. You know, cemeteries of the time were still doing kind of random burials. They were laying out burials as they came chronologically, not in groups of families. And what's interesting about this cemetery is this was created when New Haven ran out of space after an outbreak of yellow fever epidemic. They needed more space. A very big influence on the designers of Mount Auburn Cemetery was Père Lachaise and the picturesque design of that cemetery, created by Napoleonic decree in 1804. Père Lachaise was a kind of repurposing of an old Jesuit estate on an escarpment overlooking the city of Paris. It was a reuse of a landscape that was turned into a picturesque landscape for commemorative purposes to serve the city of Paris. And what was distinctive about it was its plan. It incorporated English picturesque design ideas that included a kind of elliptical, broad carriage avenues that were interspersed with smaller pedestrian walking paths. It also included the carriage avenues were designed so that they would reveal vistas and classical monuments to their best advantage. Bigelow and Dearborn also looked at the English country estates. These were based upon 18th century ideals of scenery, which were a kind of pastoral or domesticated landscape rather than a kind of sublime wilderness. It was a landscape shaped by the hand of man. And finally, the founders of Mount Auburn wanted their landscape to look like a picture. This was the idea of the picturesque. They wanted it to be beautiful. The Society, right away in 1831, established a garden and cemetery committee with a subcommittee of 3 men, Henry A.S. Dearborn, Jacob Bigelow, and George W. Brimmer. They got to work in the fall of 1831, agreeing that the beauty of the natural features of the landscape were paramount and needed only slight embellishment. Dearborn supervised every summer for, I think, 3 summers. He supervised the laying out of gently curving avenues for carriages. He planned them to be 18 to 20 feet wide and adapting picturesquely to the surfaces of the ground, enhancing the beauty of the natural shape of the land. Dearborn also saw to the supervising of the laying out of all of the walking paths. And the walking paths were about 6 feet in width, and they would lead pedestrians up into the more broken and precipitous parts of the landscape. And they also would provide access to views and to cemetery lots within the landscape. During this time, Dr. Bigelow visited as often as he could, and he was responsible for naming all of the roads and paths and sort of passing it by Henry Dearborn, who agreed. He chose simple and rural botanical names, osier, linden, catalpa, for all the names of paths. So when you go to other rural cemeteries in the country, you'll see the same path signs and botanical names. Mr. Brimmer, whose land this once was, also frequently visited. And remember, he had set the sort of Mount Auburn design in motion when it was his estate, having put in his own carriage avenues and having planted ornamental trees and evergreens. And then Justice Story, who would become the cemetery's first president, was often there while the landscape was being shaped, spending hours and manifesting a deep interest in the enterprise. Dearborn created a plan for borders 10 feet in width to be planted with shrubs, bulbous and perennial flowers. What kept the landscape from being overcrowded, like Père Lachaise, for example, was Dearborn's plan to set lots back from the passageways, back from the avenues and the paths, which resulted in keeping a sense of spaciousness in the landscape. The success of their design, which we still see today in the landscape and which so many of us admire, is this idea of the balance of art and nature, one in balance with the other. Today we'd call Dearborn the landscape architect of Mount Auburn Cemetery. And he was an industrious one. A fellow horticulturalist remembered seeing him, hoe in hand, day after day at the head of his laborers, leveling and grading the walks and taking his dinner with him, which he would step into the Wyeth house across the road to eat. He had subcontracted with a skilled surveyor from Maine to make the first plan of Mount Auburn Cemetery. Alexander Wadsworth was young. I think he was only 25 when he came to work for Henry Dearborn. He was the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's cousin. And he created this map of the cemetery. It's the first plan of the cemetery, and it's also the first topographical map of its kind in the United States. And when you look at it, you can see here are these lovely elliptical carriage avenues, and in between them, interspersed in between these carriage avenues, much like Père Lachaise Cemetery, are the walking paths. What's great about Alexander Wadsworth is when Dearborn was called to Washington, and after his 3 or 4 years of designing, Wadsworth continued Dearborn's work and continued to lay out at Mount Auburn into the 1850s. So he too had a hand in the design of Mount Auburn Cemetery. And this is the quintessential view by James Smiley. It's an engraving that dates to 1847 from our historical collections and archives. And for me, it really sums up that early design idea. You can see the plants in front, you can see the border and the setbacks from the road before you reach a 300 square foot family lot. In the middle of the 300 square foot family lot is a central monument. In this case, it's a monument to William Ellery Channing, a beloved Unitarian minister. And then that 300 square foot lot would be surrounded by a practical and functional, but also tasteful enclosure, such as a cast iron fence or curbing. This was the design idea that Bigelow, Dearborn, and the Horticultural Society envisioned for the new cemetery. It's also a place where families would come, they'd read the inscriptions, they'd bring their children, and they'd learn about their country and be inspired. There was a didactic purpose, a celebration of New England that also found great success here at Mount Auburn and was copied around the country. So it's really true that Mount Auburn preserves a remarkably illustrative chronicle of American landscape design, attitudes about death and commemoration, aesthetic and spiritual values, material culture and changing technology. And successive generations have added layer upon layer, discernible historic layers to the original landscape since Dearborn, Brimmer, and Bigelow laid it out. They've all contributed to this complex tapestry that reveals the ideals and values of New Englanders for nearly 2 centuries. And here at Mount Auburn, the mission of horticulture was given tangible form. Horticulture was given tangible form to the garden cemetery, and you'll see this when you visit garden cemeteries across the country. So while it's seen great changes over 189 years, the original design of Mount Auburn is largely intact, and its historical integrity and origins are still evident today. including its horticultural evidence. By placing the grave in the garden, Mount Auburn's horticultural founders forever changed burial practices in our country. And today, Mount Auburn continues to reflect the science and aesthetic of its 19th century horticulturalist founders. I think Henry Dearborn would be proud of our current experimental garden by the greenhouse and of our vibrant citizen science efforts. The cemetery is today a renowned botanical garden with remarkable diversity, and it's an accredited arboretum with nearly 9,000 trees and shrubs representing 1,000 taxa that include species and cultivated varieties. Bigelow, Brimmer, and Dearborn's papers are being transcribed with new technology that I think, or I like to think, would make Jacob Bigelow very proud. So just to sum up, because Mount Auburn is a beautiful green space in Boston, many people assume that it was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And now I hope all of you know that instead it was a collaborative design. It was a collaborative design, mostly beginning with Dr. Jacob Bigelow. I would say it was Dr. Jacob Bigelow's brainchild. It was made possible by George Watson Brimmer, and then it moved into the capable hands of Henry A.S. Dearborn to be designed. I might add that Olmsted was 9, I think he was 9 in 1831, but he was, at the end of his life, cremated at Mount Auburn before being buried with his family in Connecticut. But these three men, Dearborn, Brimmer, and Bigelow, believed in the harmonious and resuscitating influence of nature. With their intelligence and their patriotism, they believed that horticulture cultivated the mind as well as the soil, and that their work at Mount Auburn would elevate the character of the Commonwealth and that of its citizens. Today, Mount Auburn is many things. It's a human storyscape, a sacred site of burial, an urban refuge, a wildlife habitat, an important birding site, a community resource. But our mission is the same as it was in 1831. Mount Auburn Cemetery inspires all who visit, comforts the bereaved, and commemorates the dead in a landscape of exceptional beauty. Even when it's hard, I hope everyone takes care. Mount Auburn is open, actually. I will have some questions and I can speak to those now, but just to let you know, the cemetery is open to all visitors. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. That was fascinating. And we have questions and comments and lots of accolades for you in the chat. So if you're willing to take a few questions, I will start asking.
I'd love to. I'm much more comfortable having a conversation than giving a presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Then a conversation we shall have. So Pat is asking if many of the original oaks, beech, and pines on the Stone Estate when it was acquired for the cemetery are still existing at Mount Auburn today.
There are beautiful trees, many of them oaks, actually black oak, red oak, that predate the cemetery. A lot of people, because the beeches are so huge, think the beeches are the old ones, but I know oaks, the Quercus are predating the cemetery, but I'm not sure about pines. We can speak to our horticulture staff about that, but there are tree maps, and we do have a curator of plant collections, the same way I'm the curator of our historical collections and archives. and all of the trees have labels. So you can find out information about the trees very easily. If we know it, a date will be on the little label that's on the tree. I don't think we know many of the ones that predate. I mean, for example, Henry Dearborn transplanted 1,200 to 1,300 trees from his estate in Roxbury. And I don't think we know which ones those are.
Okay, great. And there's a shout out for Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford, Connecticut. Another
Good. Hello, Cedar Hill. Hi, colleagues. We'll come visit you. I hope you're doing okay. That's nice.
Robert is asking, which I think is a question that probably gets asked quite often, and everybody always wants to know, are plots still available?
Yeah, there are a lot of plots available. They should be available for 200 more years, according to our master plan. So you can still be buried at Mount Auburn. Something that's interesting now is that there are all sorts of different ways that you can be buried at Mount Auburn. The green cemetery movement and natural burials are very popular at Mount Auburn, and it speaks to how cemeteries reflect interests of the time. You know, Mount Auburn is very interested in minimizing its own carbon footprint, and I know many of us are interested in that. So there are new ways of burial that reflect those values. It's not free to be buried at Mount Auburn. It's expensive. I think a typical price is $30,000 and up if you're interested in that. But our cemetery staff can help you if you're interested in either being cremated or buried at Mount Auburn. I think what the expense is really the memorial. When you walk around today and you see all the big tombs, not many people do that today. You know, someone with a lot of money is more likely to give a hospital wing than to build a huge mausoleum in a cemetery these days. But some people still do, not frequently in Boston, I might add. But there are all sorts of different ways to commemorate someone that you love, or even better yet, to plan your own burial plans, to make your own burial plans or cremation plans. That's a great gift to your family. That's one thing I've learned. You know, as a curator there for more than 25 years, it's a great thing to let your family know what your plans are.
And on that, Suzanne just added that her family purchased a spot in a cremation garden there, and that was not expensive, she said. So maybe a more affordable way to go.
Yeah.
Mary Beth has a great question. What do you see as the next era in Mount Auburn's storied history? Increasing attention to environmental diversity, preservation of monuments, and thanking you for the wonderful talk.
Thank you so much for that question. Well, I think it has to do with the environment. You know, our current era right now is one where we've reduced our carbon footprint by 22%, and we've created a zero net goal. I don't know it yet, but I know we're moving to all renewable energy, and we're doing whatever we can to record what's growing on the grounds in support of climate science. I think the cemetery is an extraordinary place to do field study work, because monuments and plants have been there for a very long time. So you can document change over time, both for preservation of memorials, particularly the marble ones, which erode in the New England air, but also for plants and which plants are growing as our temperature changes. So it seems to me it's one that's very interested in using the resources from our past to help take care of our future. But we're also doing a strategic plan, and so that includes being welcoming and open. It includes, diversity and equity. It includes really looking at how can a cemetery function also as a cultural institution. It's a good time for us to be looking internally. So we're planning our future. It's a very sound institution, and I'm grateful to be working there.
Great. All right. Sally is asking, who pays for the upkeep?
Yeah, the doesn't pay for my work, but the endowment is really wonderful and healthy and pays. It's the endowment along with the fees of cemetery sales that goes into supporting the grounds and to making the grounds so beautiful and to paying for the staff. Mount Auburn's unusual as a cemetery because there are 50 full-time staff typically on board, and then there are seasonal workers that grow the staff to 100 in the summertime. So the endowment is really what is used to make the cemetery so beautiful. If we want to do any preservation projects, or for example, my work in the archives, we need to raise money to do those projects because the endowment is earmarked for the grounds. So collections work, preservation work is active fundraising work at the cemetery, but the grounds are, seen really by the staff as the entire memorial. It's the whole place that's, so beautiful, and that can be seen as the whole memorial.
Great. Okay. Somebody interested in information on crowdsourcing and citizen scientist opportunities.
Citizen scientist opportunities, I can, if you send me here's my email up on the screen. If you send me an email, I can get you to the person who's in charge of our citizen science opportunities. The transcribing, the crowdsourcing project that we're doing is a transcription project, and that address is also on the screen where it says help transcribe our history. In fact, if you're interested in the history of Mount Auburn, this is an incredible place to go. You do not have to transcribe. You can just go and read all the trustee minutes from the early years or the correspondence with a superintendent. It's a gold mine. It is making our records accessible in a way they've never been accessible before to anyone with a computer and an internet for free, anywhere in the world. And that's the same because it's a crowdsourcing project. Anyone can join and help us transcribe. It's just been incredible. It's great. So both of those projects, the citizen science and the transcription project, have been really innovative and helpful, making an impact.
Great. And a shout out here for Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky.
Hello, Louisville. Hello, Cave Hill. That's been a long time. That's a beautiful cemetery too. We're so lucky. In fact, I think that someone like the Mellon or the Getty should fund cemetery superintendents to be able to visit all the other rural cemeteries in the country and say hello and meet and talk and show not just the cemetery services part, but the preservation and the archives. It's a wonderful world still to be discovered.
All right, Megan, how does one get a tree map?
Tree maps are available in the visitor center, and they're also available in one of the alcoves of the cemetery if you're visiting. I'm not sure if they're available on our website. Our website has a store, www.mountauburn.org. It's a store where sometimes you can ask for things. I'm happy to find out for you if you want to send me a little note. I know you can pick them up on site, but if you can't get on site, or if you're from far away, we can certainly send you one. There's one for champion trees. What's exciting is our horticulture staff have just launched a database of flora. It's called Flora, And it's so new that I don't have the address in my mind, but it's on our website. So you may be able to use that. It's a GIS mapping system to find trees as well.
Great. Okay. And a question from David. What do you think General Dearborn learned from his experience that he brought to Forest Hills?
Wow. He was experienced when he was at Forest Hills, and he was so admired. He was admired as an industrious man. He cut such a great figure. You know, a carriage was named after him because he was always in his carriage. He was so fervent at the beginning of Mount Auburn Cemetery. He envisioned much more than actually an experimental garden. He envisioned a school and scientific experiments and all sorts of wonderful horticultural ideas that actually we're beginning to implement now. But when he got to Forest Hills, he knew how to design and he knew how to lay out the land. He was beloved by his workers. And I think there's a wonderful story at Forest Hills where, you know, after he died and he's buried there at Forest Hills, there was a vase and the workers would go and put flowers in his vase in his honor. He was just cherished as the leader of designing that cemetery.
Great. No, such great questions here. Can you speak to the maintenance of the statues in the cemetery? How are their restorations prioritized and funded? And this is from Joan, who recalls reading about the statue at the Binney plot, which she thinks you had in your slideshow.
That's correct. That was in the slideshow with all the yellow and purple flowers. That was one of my favorite projects ever in my time at Mount Auburn. Yes, that's something that I do as a curator. It's complicated because at Mount Auburn and at a cemetery, there's perpetual care. So if there are more than 40,000 monuments at Mount Auburn, about a third of them are under perpetual care. So those are maintained on a cyclical basis with washing and pointing and kept plumb. And the wording is, as long as they shall last. So if there's anything that kind of transcends that maintenance, it's prioritized by the preservation staff at Mount Auburn. And the way we began, instead of sort of picking things on a case-by-case basis in 2013, is I identified this small group of 30 that were the most significant monuments on the grounds. And that was a very helpful thing to do, because from there, we were able to meet with a conservator and look at the condition of each of those 30. It's a much more manageable to group, you know, to start small. And then we've added the next 30, and I envision adding the next 30. You know, our preservation staff are extraordinary. They prioritize things by safety first, and then they go from there. But they start with that, and then if something's in a historic site or by an important person, about an important person, a unique example of the vernacular, we just sort of imagine if something were to happen and Mount Auburn would disappear, what is the most unique thing? I'd be happy to talk about that more. We have some guidelines, and it's something we work on every day.
Good. I think we might have to have a part 2 of this lecture to.
Yeah, we could keep going into the. You know, we really aborted this. There was a lot of design that happens afterwards, and it continues today. I'm so delighted because the questions are all about Mount Auburn today. It's wonderful.
Right. So another question from Ron, that you mentioned that the Brimmer property was 72 acres.
Yeah.
What motivated the addition of other parcels, and when were these added?
Yes, and in fact, the Brimmer property was not 72. He bought the stone farm, and then I think he purchased 2 additional parcels of land to bring the stone farm to what we now know as Mount Auburn Street, to create the 72 acres that were the original size of the cemetery in 1831. Other members of the Stone family sold their plots of land over time. There was a little spur for the Boston and for the railroad on the southeast side of the cemetery, and so that different parcels were sold that were of contiguous land over time.
All right, and for something completely different, Meg, Linda's asking if pets can be buried at Mount Auburn.
Yes, in Massachusetts, there's a state law that does not allow pets to be buried with humans. So there's a law about that. A lot of people who see the wonderful dog monuments think maybe a dog is buried under there, but they're they're symbolic of being loyal. So they're a symbolic monument, but also oftentimes they're portraits of dogs or just dog monuments that have been selected for their subject matter. That's not to say that sometimes cemetery staff in the past may have looked the other direction. As we know, pet relationships can be as important as or more so than our human relations.
Certainly.
But pets are not allowed.
And Julie's asking, are there guided tours?
There are guided tours. There are not guided tours at the moment, though, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a wonderful, flourishing Friends program. And right now, all the tours are virtual. And the programming is virtual, but they're introductory guided tours, they're audio tours. And we'll be having tours again, just not right now.
Okay, and from Gail, are Dearborn, Bigelow, and Brimmer buried at Mount Auburn?
Well, Dearborn is, in thanks for his assiduous duties to the laying out of Mount Auburn, he was given a lot at Mount Auburn Cemetery. And then after he designed Forest Hills Cemetery, he moved his family from Mount Auburn to Forest Hills, where he's buried on top of a hill called Dearborn Hill or Mount Dearborn, or where he's buried now. So you can visit Henry A.S. Dearborn at Forest Hills Cemetery. Brimmer, George Watson Brimmer, who died young, is buried at Mount Auburn, and Jacob Bigelow is buried at Mount Auburn on Central Ave.
Okay, what is the best time of year to visit the cemetery? But I assume each season has its own merits, from Linda.
Yeah, it's like all historic sites. They get overwhelmed in the spring, and Mother's Day may be the busiest time of year. So if you're looking for a peaceful walk, don't come in the glorious sort of second week of May, which is spectacular with blossoms, but crowded. I love the fall. I think the fall is extraordinary. And in the winter, I'll say every season when I'm done this sentence, in the winter, you can see the architecture of the trees and the shape of the land, and you can see things in a completely different way. It's beautiful. But before the snow comes and it's not safe to walk around, that's also a lovely time. I love the fall because the trees are magnificent and the colors are just extraordinary.
Okay, and in the last couple minutes, we'll try and get through as many of these as we can, Meg. But from Stephen, are there specific sections of the cemetery reserved originally or still for segments of our population, such as Jews, Blacks, veterans, and others? Were certain groups of people prohibited from burial in earlier times?
Yes. Mount Auburn was very democratic in its vision. Right from the beginning in 1831, it was open to everyone, open to all, and there were no types of people sectioned off the way they are in many cemeteries. So you'll find people all buried all together, no sections, except there's one exception to the sectioning, which is they had this idea, as I first said, of family lots. And right away, right at the beginning, they saw not everyone has a family. So they laid out what they called public lots, which were for single graves. So that was a shift in the thinking in the design thinking. But no matter what race, no matter you know, what your religion was, you were welcomed at Mount Auburn always. I think the real thing was, you know, you pay, if you can you can stay, as Peter Gomes once said.
Great. All right. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There's a couple more questions here. Some of them I think you can answer very quickly, Meg, if you're okay hanging with us for another
Certainly.
minute. Is there a guidebook available showing the notable monuments and burials?
So there is a book of the 30 most significant monuments that I put out with Melissa that's available through the website or there at the cemetery visitor center. There isn't a guidebook. You know, there's a really big book by Blanche Linden Ward, which was sort of iconic and historic and really set the precedent for cemetery history. It's called Silent City on a Hill. And we have a bibliography that's really helpful of different articles that have been written. The monuments themselves, that would be some handouts that we have at the front desk, or else the book I wrote with Melissa Banta.
Okay, great. And Suzanne asking what year the tower was built.
The tower was built in 1852. That was designed by Jacob Bigelow and built by Gridley J.F. Bryant. And it gave you this panopticon sublime, this beautiful view from the city of the dead to the city of the living. It was part of the initial landscape design to have that tower on top of the hill.
Okay, and Lynn asking if you know if Green Lawn in Salem has any connection to Dearborn, especially as it is a few blocks from Dearborn Street.
Now, Green Lawn, I've been there so often. I don't think he designed it, but I could be wrong. I have to check on that one. I don't know that one.
Okay, and two last questions here. Is there, I think you had mentioned this, but a recent hardcover coffee table book with lots of Mount Auburn photos?
Oh yes, that's a beautiful book. That's by Richard Cheek. That you could use that as a guidebook. I mean, it's called Beauty on the Edge of Eternity, and it's a lovely gift. It's a gift of photographs by Richard Cheek of Mount Auburn Cemetery. Beautiful book. Also on our website or in the visitor center.
All right, and lastly, maybe a good one to close with, but who are some of the Bostonians that are buried?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. Harrison Gray Otis and your founder,